Great. Kevin, do you want to start sharing the screen? And welcome everyone to our webinar. Thank you so much for being here with us. And feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat while we wait for others to join, if that's okay. Great. Well, we're really excited to share with you today key takeaways from our newest brief, New Directions in Racial and Economic Justice, how California's worker centers are bringing worker power into workforce development, which focuses on the role of worker centers in workforce development. My name is Ana Luz Gonzalez Vasquez, and I'm a project manager at the UCLA Labor Center. With me today are Magali Lopez. She's a senior research analyst at the UCLA Labor Center, and Kevin Lee. He's a PhD candidate at MIT. And we have two wonderful guest speakers with us today. Aquiliana Soriano Versosa, she's the executive director at the Filipino Worker Center, and Elaine Velasper, she's the associate director at the Filipino Worker Center. Move on to the next slide. So our webinar will be split into 4 parts. During the first half, we're going to be providing some context and presenting our research findings. And in the longer second half, we're going to have a discussion to hear how worker centers, from worker centers and how they approach workforce development. In this session, we hope that you'll learn from worker centers. These are community-based organizations that are built by workers for workers about what workforce development looks like when it's driven by marginalized communities, how they approach skills building, leadership development, and employer engagement, and how they apply labor enforcement, organizing, and advocacy mechanisms to improve the quality of work and to raise industry standards. And for those of you who are not familiar with our work, the UCLA Labor Center is a unit of the Research Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, and we have a 50-year track record of research, education, policy work, and leadership development that promotes higher industry standards, creates jobs that are good for communities, and strengthens racial equity and immigrant rights. And I'm really proud to introduce to you one of our newest areas of work at the Labor Center, Prosperity, Opportunity, and Worker Equity Reimagined, Power in Workforce Development. And while our team is quite small, we have over 2 decades of experience with research and evaluation on low-wage work and worker centers. We focus on applied research, lifting up non-traditional workforce development practices in organizations that serve the most marginalized communities. Evaluation, we're creating a workforce development program evaluation framework that is culturally responsive and that's conducted through a racial equity lens. And alliance building, we're gathering networks of experts to guide efforts to enhance equity and job quality in California's public workforce development system in collaboration with state labor agencies. Can you go on to the next slide? But before we share more about the study we conducted, I'll begin by sharing some context. Historically, workforce development systems have not prioritized low-wage industries, and we know that the workforce development systems have also not produced the positive outcomes for the most marginalized workers in our state. But low-wage workers make up a significant portion of the workforce. In fact, 1 in 3 workers in California are low-wage workers, and 3 in 4 of those workers are workers of color, and 40% are immigrants. And when compared to the total California workforce, low-wage workers are twice as likely to work part-time. They're less likely to be members of a union. They're less likely to receive employer-provided health insurance and retirement benefits. And they're also more likely to live in households with incomes below the federal poverty line. But what's exciting about current times is that conversations on workforce development are evolving to more intentionally center worker voice, equity, and job quality. These are priorities that have long been the focus of worker centers and movements for racial and economic justice more generally. Now, given the state's focus on equity and job quality, we saw an opportunity to lift up the work that worker centers do. And if we're going to address equity and job quality in the workforce development system, we have to start with low-wage industries. Go on to the next slide. Now, worker centers, like I said before, are built by and for workers of color that have historically been excluded from workforce development opportunities. They've existed since the 1920s, but they exploded in growth nationwide in the early 2000s to support and address the needs of low-wage workers and immigrants by changing industry standards. But what's important to know about worker centers is that they exist in many parts of the workforce that are not unionized and among immigrant populations that have not had the opportunity to join unions. Each worker center may look different from the next, as each serves different populations, operates in different industries, engages in different activities, and even adopts different approaches to addressing systemic issues that prevent communities of color from thriving. But they all do important work at the forefront of racial and economic justice. And they're now taking new leadership in redefining workforce development. And while much is known about worker centers' engagement in community organizing and policy advocacy, their role in workforce development remains poorly understood. Now, I wanted to show these images because they illustrate how our work with worker centers began. In the early 2000s, community-based organizations and worker centers approached us to do a study on day labor and day labor worker centers. And at the time, day laborers were being harassed by anti-immigrant organizations, local businesses, and police. As a graduate student, I worked with Professors Abel Valenzuela, Nick Theodore, and Edwin Melendez to document the working conditions of day laborers and the best practices of the organizations that help them. And if you look at the far left picture, you'll see that day laborers were being asked to congregate in the areas that you see with the yellow poles. And it's obviously impossible for all those workers to stand between those poles. So community-based organizations reached out and said, we need to do something about this. And what the study did is it highlighted the experience of day laborers, the number of day laborers that experience wage theft. It also highlighted, it did a lot to improve industry standards and protecting workers from unscrupulous employers. And now I'll go ahead and hand it over to Magali Lopez, who will share more about our study.
Thanks, Ana Luz. And thank you all for joining us today. I actually want to start by, I'll share a little bit about the research study that we conducted, but I just want to start by thanking LRAN. This study wouldn't have been possible without LRAN or the UCLA Labor Center's generosity, or without the participation of several of the worker centers, including those that are joining us today. So on behalf of our team, we just want to say thank you. And then I'll just say one more thing before I go further into the research. So you'll see on the next screen that you'll have, there we go, the next one, yeah. So on the next screen, you can access the study through that QR code. Just point your camera toward it and it should link you directly to our brief. All right, so now about the study. We started in early 2020. Ana Luz, Kevin, and I started the study just as an initial effort to better understand alignment between worker centers and workforce development. We began by conducting a scan of worker centers across California, and we just wanted to collect baseline information about the populations that they serve, the industries that they work with, and any other information that was relevant to just help us better understand the landscape. That initial search really helped us to update the universe of worker centers, and it helped us to move on to the next phase of the work, which was the interviews. We then went on to conduct interviews. We conducted we interviewed 12 interviews out of the 35 worker centers that we identified throughout the state. And this happened right on the onset of COVID. So we're really thankful that we were able to connect with folks, and as this transition to, just virtual living and working was happening. So we collected all that data and we analyzed it, and we decided to share our research findings through this public-facing brief. We think that this brief, for the first time, intentionally documents the worker center approach to workforce development and not the other way around, or you know, other studies also capture some aspects of the work, but not in the context of workforce development. So this brief really focuses on the work that worker centers do and how that work just also works toward the same goals that workforce development folks in that field are prioritizing. So things like providing training opportunities to underserved communities, improving industry standards, and other similar activities. We also know that the workforce development system doesn't always reach the folks that can most use their resources. So in this brief, we really attempt to lift up the value of worker centers and their approach as we work toward creating opportunities for economic prosperity for everyone in California post-pandemic. We think that through this study, we're making two important contributions. First, we're providing an updated universe of worker centers in California. You saw the pretty map that Ana Luz showed earlier in the PowerPoint, where you'll see where they're generally located. And then I'll also add that we're very intentional about how we define worker centers so that we focus on the organizations that were created for and by workers. So I think that's also an important component of that, universe of worker centers that we're talking about. And then second contribution is that we capture this intersection between workforce centers and workforce development. And we do so by describing how worker center efforts are relevant to this more comprehensive approach to workforce development that we've all been dreaming up. We've all been thinking about a system that reaches the communities that are most in need and that looks beyond placements as a solution to economic opportunity. Next slide, please. So in this next slide, I'll just go over our high-level key findings, and then we'll transition into hearing from the real experts in the room. So through this study, we found that worker centers are showing that it is possible to reach low-wage workers and industries that workforce development providers often can't reach. And here we emphasize, the low-wage workers. They're usually not prioritized in some of our efforts. Second, we know that, the departments within our labor agency tend to work in silos. And so worker centers are demonstrating that working at the intersection of workforce development and labor standards enforcement can create opportunities to transform low-wage work. And then finally, traditionally in workforce development, we don't typically see organizing and policy advocacy as important components to workforce development efforts, but worker centers are modeling how community organizing and policy advocacy are important tools that are needed to change the very fabric of the workforce development system and other systems that contribute to inequality. So those are our top three findings. We'll with these findings in mind, we'll have a conversation now with some of our partners from the worker centers, because they can speak more to, the intersection of the worker center approach and this comprehensive approach to workforce development that we've been talking about. So I'll turn the mic over to Kevin. He is our third partner in crime, so he'll be moderating the conversation.
Thank you so much, Magali. We're transitioning into our panel. I'm just going to stop sharing so that we can see each other a little better. As I was mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we're so privileged and grateful to have two longstanding leaders of worker centers and low-wage work in California and really nationwide here today. Aquilina Soriano Versosa is a founder and current executive director of the Filipino Worker Center of Southern California, a worker center serving and organizing the low-wage Filipino immigrant community in LA. She has over 2 decades of experience working in the Filipino community in LA and the Philippines, as well as a leader of PwC. As the executive director of PwC, she has been absolutely core to its leadership in growing statewide and national movements of domestic workers. Aki is also serving on the board of Mission Asset Fund and as the current president of the board of directors of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Elaine Velasper is an associate director of Filipino Community Center, which was founded in 2004 and aims to provide a safe space where Filipino families can access services, receive support, and build community, as well as engage in community empowerment, grassroots leadership, advocacy, and organizing to address the immediate and long-term issues of Filipino communities, specifically in the Bay Area and in the Philippines. Elaine was previously the Vice Chair of Education for Gabriela USA, the North American chapter of the National Filipino Women's Rights Organization, and has over a decade of experience in advocating for social justice, human rights, and the empowerment of marginalized immigrant Filipinos. Let's start out with a really brief question. Aki and Elaine, could you please tell us a little bit more about your organizations and the work that you do before we move into the substantive questions? Maybe just like a minute each. Aki, do you want to start first?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. And my name is Akilina, but everyone calls me Aki. And the Filipino Workers Center, I'm one of the founders, and we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year, actually officially as May 1st. And our focus around organizing low-wage Filipino immigrant workers is really focused around home care workers right now, and then additional industries through our anti-human trafficking program. But where we've been really focused is on organizing and supporting the leadership of Filipino immigrant home care workers. Many of them are undocumented, and in creating comprehensive strategies so that we can transform the industry, build worker power in the industry, and also really have the vibrant leadership of domestic workers in our democracy. And so it includes services, it includes policy work, it includes workplace organizing, legal strategies like wage theft, and overall education and outreach of our members in the community.
Elaine, do you want to go next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Elaine. And then just a brief thing, I'm also part-time mothering right now. So if you see my kid kind of just pop off from the side, bear with me. I'm with the Filipino Community Center. We are an organization that's almost 20 years old. I started as an intern, as a volunteer, and just kind of grew up with the Filipino Community Center. We were founded post 9/11 during a time when there was a massive layoff and displacement of workers out of SFO, when there was this new rule that all of the workers there had to be permanent residents or green card holders. And so, through this campaign, that was really the beginning of understanding that it's there. Just because workers have jobs doesn't mean that they're not going to be exploited or let go. We, just like Aki and PwC, we also serve a lot of Filipino caregivers, domestic workers, home care workers. That is the nature of the Filipinos, the immigrant Filipinos and low-wage Filipinos in California. And that is one of the biggest industries that we're in. We also serve low-wage restaurant workers and hotel workers in San Francisco. Large part of our members are undocumented workers. And so what that means is a lot of our work is labor enforcement, workers' rights, advocacy, leadership training, but also the intersection of being a migrant, especially as undocumented migrant in this country. And so a lot of immigration services, legal services, human trafficking, advocacy, and campaign work. And I think a lot of the work that we do in the Filipino Community Center is advocating for the rights of workers in their workplaces, but also advocating, supporting workers when they are at a place of crisis. We have a lot of workers that come to us, when they're facing difficulties in their lives, either inside their workplace or, some another aspect of their lives. And so we do a lot of services and case management around that also.
Thank you so much, Elaine. So we'll be asking three main sets of questions that are very much aligned with the organization of our research brief. And so the first question will address the community and worker-centered aspects of worker centers. The second, the industry-driven aspects, and the third, the systems change kind of aspects. So I'm just going to resume sharing my screen so that folks can be guided through this conversation. Okay. Here we go. Can folks see it? Okay, perfect. So Elaine, kind of building on what you so wonderfully mentioned just now about how Filipino Community Center really focuses on meeting the needs of workers in crisis. So there's a lot of dialogue right now, as Magali mentioned, about worker-centered approaches to workforce development. And what came across so clearly just now is how being community and worker-centered is so central to everything that you do. And so what does that look like at your worker center specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I think, we have to acknowledge that we are at a time of the pandemic still, right? And I think, understanding advocacy for workers and supporting the development of leadership and power of workers, we really saw during the pandemic that is central and very important inside the workplace. But even more during the pandemic, it showed that there's a lot of things that the government and worker centers and communities have to respond to in relation to the workers as a whole person, their whole lives. And so when their children are sick, when there's no school, when the economy is shut down and their workplaces closed down, what happens to all of these workers? And so a lot of our work in the pandemic was really shaped by shifting and adapting to the developing needs of workers during this time. Sometimes it looks like developing a food program where we access and respond to food insecurity, because so many workers, during the pandemic, don't have cars, don't have access to grocery stores, or are elderly and can't go outside, and so we're really fearful of being able to access food, and so delivering food to them was essential and critical. A lot of times, providing a lot of wraparound services when they're in the midst of a crisis, whether it be violence in their homes, fleeing an exploitative worker employer, being trafficked, or even just facing unemployment, not knowing how to access unemployment benefits or just any other services. And so, a lot of our work at the Filipino Community Center starts with basic services that immigrants and low-wage workers need, and then we develop it to address migrant issues, immigrant issues, and then also workers' issues.
Thank you so much. That's so illuminating as always and so inspiring. Aki, let's turn to you briefly. So some folks think that worker centers have no relationships or just contentious relationships with employers, but a key aspect of your work is sort of working with employers in a range of industries, in the domestic work industry, in the home care work industry, and employers also benefiting from being able to look for workers at your worker center. And I'd love to hear more about how your worker centers are industry driven in their approach to workforce development. And maybe we can start with, maybe you could describe a little bit about the characteristics of the industries that you work in and how you engage with employers in each of them.
Sure. Yes. Well, to start off with, so the characteristics of the industries that we work with primarily are home care, which is a part of the domestic worker industry, where individuals are providing long-term supports and services, primarily for elders who are aging in their own homes. So they're working in individual homes. Sometimes they are hired directly by families. Sometimes they are hired through agencies. And this is all a part of the private pay market. So if you don't have working authorization, you can't work through the state program, sponsored program, which is IHSS. So we actually are organizing in the private sector. And this is where we find a lot of the exploitation is happening as well. The other part of the other industry we're working with is the residential care facilities for the elderly. So this is not the domestic worker industry, but very linked and very similar. And there's workers go between these two industries to work in small boarding care facilities. And so these are residential homes that are transformed to care for usually about 6 clients per home. And many of them are, independently owned and operated. The owners usually hire a few caregivers per home to care for the residents that they're providing long-term supports for. And this could be funded this also private, although it could be out of pocket directly by individuals, paid for directly by the families or the individuals, or it could also be Medicaid dollars that are also paying for the clients to be in these boarding care facilities. And we have seen quite regularly that wage theft is a huge issue across the board in both of these industries. It's very common for our members to be live-in workers, providing care around the clock and just being paid a lump sum per day that is much lower than minimum wage, with no overtime or benefits, very low job security, no health care, and often, they're waking up throughout the night. So it's a very tiring job and very heavy job, because this person is relying on you. If they fall, if something happens to them, it is a very heavy, high stress, but can also be a very rewarding job as well. In the RCFEs, we have seen workers paid as low as $49 for a day, and that's also for 24-hour shifts, working around the clock, caring for like 6 to 10 beds. So we do have relationships. I think in the domestic worker industry specifically, there's a lot of potential for connecting with employers, especially those who are families. This is, a different industry where anyone could become an employer tomorrow. And we really see the value of care, actually the quality of life of both those who are receiving the long-term supports and services and the workers who are providing it, that the essential valuing of care is so critical to both, because these are two vulnerable populations, elders and people with disabilities who rely on these supports and services to be able to remain active in their own communities, and then the workers who are providing the care, who traditionally were, a lot of them from the South were formerly slaves, who continued to do the work in the homes, and as well as now both largely immigrant women and women of color. So there's this opportunity. We work together to advocate for an infusion of investment into the industry, so everyone can afford care, access the care that they need, as well as basing that accessibility on paying workers what they should be valued at. Because clients also know themselves, it makes a difference in the quality of care someone can provide if they are also being provided for with the wages that they should be getting. This studies show that clients want to pay their home care workers more because they value them so much. So there's opportunity to actually work in coalition around advocacy and around figuring out what are ways to support families, agencies, and business owners to come into compliance with laws. Because of course, paying less than minimum wage also opens up individuals for risk and to be sued. We just won an $8.6 million citation against Adat Shalom, residential care facility for the elderly. So, so there are definitely other employers who want to comply with the laws and want to work with us, as well as, caregiving is one of the fastest growing jobs in the country and in California. So there's a large need for caregivers, and we also do workforce development training. So we do have, employers and potential employers reaching out to PwC to try and connect with home care workers. But we do definitely have contentious relationships as well. So we have both.
Thank you so much for all of that, Aki. Very quickly, could you say a little bit more about the exciting new grant for developing the home care co-op? Because I think folks will want to be, might want to ask questions about that later on.
Yes, so excited. So PwC has already built, incubated and supported the establishment of Courage Home Care, which is a LLC co-op model that provides, doesn't matter your immigration status, you can be a worker owner of this co-op. And we are about to launch into an 18-month design phase to actually build out a kind of franchise or federated model where we can actually support the establishment of many small cooperatives that are working and have shared infrastructure that makes it a lot easier for immigrant and home care workers to be able to launch their own cooperatives with a lighter touch of technical assistance, still with technical assistance, but help them to, with shared infrastructure, to onboard new worker owners, to manage the daily operations, to market and onboard new clients, and really leverage collective resources to bring down the costs and to provide jobs that actually pay above minimum wage with overtime. We just were able to establish benefits into the model, as well as, it just actually really lifts the quality of job and compensation from the private market, what's typical, to actually what our Courage Co-op member owners are experiencing now. So we're really excited about this model and incorporating workforce development and leveraging workforce development dollars to be able to support the development of these cooperatives, because it's it would be incorporating the skills in terms of, the supporting the activities of daily living, but along with that would be is the learning of how to operate and run your own cooperative itself, as well as knowledge of worker rights. So all of that is baked into the workforce development program that we're launching together with this scaled home care cooperative model.
All super exciting. Thank you for sharing. So let's transition into talking about our last theme, which is about how in the work that you all do, including workforce development, community organizing, and policy advocacy, you all are very much systems oriented in the way that you think about the problems and solutions. And Elaine, maybe we can start with you. Can you share an example of a coalition that you've been a part of and any specific systemic improvements that you all have achieved through that work? I know there are many to choose from, but just one.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, of course. I think, I'll talk a little bit more about something that we're doing right now, but, in the past, we were a part of the Progressive Workers Alliance in San Francisco. And, two of the biggest campaigns that we waged in the late 2000s and early 2010s was the fight for $15, which is the $15 minimum wage in San Francisco. I know it sounds ridiculous that, such a city that's so rich cannot pay its workers more than $15. But that was a campaign that we waged and won in 2014, and then it was implemented in 2018. The other big campaign coalition that the Progressive Workers Alliance also campaigned for was for better wage theft enforcement. So like Aki mentioned, while there are laws about wage theft, the enforcement of it and ensuring that workers even understand that these are protections that they have was very, very poor, especially in the mid 2000s. And so this was a campaign that we launched and was able to help develop more capacity at the government and the city level of San Francisco for an enforcement agency that worker centers can then partner with to do worker education and advocacy, and also look for workers who were facing wage theft and help with the enforcement and on filing for cases both in the city and the state level. I think the most exciting part, and this continues on now, like I mentioned earlier, is during the pandemic. We were a part of a coalition of worker centers. We don't have a cool name. We didn't have a cool name during COVID pandemic, but we were actively just touching, having these meetings and trying to figure out like what are the workers facing now and how can we be responsive to what are the needs that are coming up. And throughout the pandemic, unemployment insurance was a big need, food insecurity, protections against COVID, and understanding what were their rights, when you get sick, or if somebody else gets sick, or if you get exposed. These were things that were happening, and they're unprecedented, right? We've never lived through a global pandemic before, and workers were going through, all of these problems, and they were facing all of these things, and there's nothing in place to address it. And so, we have come together with a number of worker centers in the Bay Area, and we conducted a survey of more than 2,000 workers throughout the Bay Area, all of them low wage workers, around what were the needs of workers. The thing is, as the economy started to reopen, there was this big talk in the media, especially. The narrative is that the economy needs to reopen, the industries need to reopen, and we need to get the economy jump started, right, for the betterment of society, for the betterment of our economy. But what we learned and what we saw is that these so-called low-wage workers, these workers who are at the front lines of being exploited and being taken advantage of and underpaid and undervalued, they were actually essential workers. They're actually the workers who make society, move forward, and they are at the very fabric of how society can actually function. And yet they are the ones who face the least amount of protection, the most exploitation, and they are at the front lines of harm. They're putting their lives and their families at risk by going to work every day. And so, we came together and we did this survey. We asked what do they need, and we have now been able to form a new coalition called BAEWA, very cool, Bay Area Essential Workers Agenda, where we took the outcomes of this survey and turned it into kind of a manifesto for the needs of essential workers, and what people usually call them as low-wage workers, but we're seeing them as now very critical essential workers, domestic workers, restaurant workers, service industry workers, and advocating for the needs that they have around pay, around access to getting their jobs back, around protections against COVID and health, but also understanding the interrelations of the other needs as families. How does childcare and workplace protections for time off factor into when children or other family members get ill, and the main breadwinner has to also take care of them or has to quarantine with the whole household. how do we have elderly and senior workers get back into the workforce when they, so much of the work of looking for work now is online or, is through technology, and they don't have access to technology. And so, these are some of the things that we saw come out of the pandemic. And, this new coalition is really trying to put together not just the agenda, but also start to lobby in a, as low as a local level. But it is something that, we view that can be taken on a larger scale. We're testing it out in San Francisco. We're advocating for worker protections in San Francisco, more funding to inform and educate workers on their rights right now. But yeah, we definitely see a really big potential for this line of work, especially because so many workers want to get back to work, but they don't want to die over it. So it's kind of this catch-22. They want to work, they want to provide for their families, but how can they if they are, when the risks that they take to go to work is so high?
Thank you so much, Elaine. I think what comes through so clearly is how you all are systematically understanding and documenting the changing and interrelated needs of your members over time, forming coalitions to address those needs through a variety of strategies, and how you all see workforce development as part of a very, very broad host of services and programs that are constantly adapted over time to address those needs. I think that's extremely illuminating. So for purposes of time, I know we want to make sure that we have time for discussion. So why don't we leap to our concluding question, which is how can we ensure that workforce development dollars are addressing the needs of our most marginalized workers, particularly those in low-wage industries? Rapid fire, 1 to 2 minutes. Aki, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I've been a part of the Workforce Equity Initiative Task Force, and we've been looking at how can we transform, there's so much money that comes through workforce development, and often it's just going to traditional providers that are not, that are not actually improving job quality. Many times they're going into kind of dead-end jobs. So the things that we've seen that need to change is, one, we need to change the metrics of how workforce development grants and dollars are measured, and that we need to overcome barriers for immigrants to access these dollars. So that's something that needs to be done on the federal level, but as well, it can be done on the local level as well. And with our LLC cooperative models, that's a way to kind of get around some of the federal exclusions that actually opens up access to workforce development money.
No, I think we might have lost Aki for a little bit. While we wait for Aki to return, Elaine, do you wanna go ahead and
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think, what Aki mentioned, right, is addressing the barriers of getting back into the workforce is really, really important. And, what we've learned from this pandemic is that the economy cannot function without exploiting, underpaying, and destabilizing workers. And these are low-wage workers, right? And so, but we've also learned that the economy cannot move forward without these workers there. And so I think it's time to develop the workplace and the economy centering the needs of workers in the development of jobs. Like I mentioned earlier, there's plenty of workers who want to work, but they want to work with dignity, and they want to work. And one of the things that we've also seen during the pandemic is that workers want to work and need to work, but they will not die over it. And so I think this juxtaposition of the pandemic has really heightened both, one, our understanding that workers are essential, and these low-wage workers need to be there in order for our society to function. But two, that the workers actually have the power. If they're not there, and if they won't stand for exploitative conditions, then society is going to go to, I was going to say hell, but society is going to go to hell. And so, yeah, I think centering the needs of the workers and even developing jobs that can actually help in the protection of workers, in the protection of, of civil society is really important. Janitorial jobs before used to be looked down upon, but now we know that the health and sanitation is such an important, critical part of fighting COVID. And so how can these jobs can be created both for the protection of the workplaces that these workers are in, but also for the protection of the citizens who go to these stores and restaurants and public places. I think addressing the needs of marginalized workers, what we see is that is good for the economy. Addressing the needs of marginalized workers is good for society. It's not just good for the workers, it's good for all of us. When these workers can do their jobs with dignity and can get livable wages, and they can get pay that actually helps them and their families thrive and flourish, our society will also flourish. And I think that's, for us, the biggest lesson that we've learned from this pandemic, and that it's not just about protecting the workers in their workplaces, it is protecting the dignity and the lives of the working class inside the workplace and outside of the workplace.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for sharing all of that. I'm looking at the time. I think we should transition into our discussion section. I think that's a perfect segue. So Magali, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Elaine and Aki. Hopefully we'll get her back on before we end. But so I just want to start by just opening up to comments or general questions. We do have some questions prepared, but if some of you, I'd rather prioritize the questions that you have. So any comments or questions coming up for anybody? Did anything that we present that the panelists shared resonate with you about the approach to workforce development that worker centers propose?
Hey, this is Emily Andrews from the Center for Law and Social Policy. Wonderful panel, so great to hear all of this. Definitely the idea of focusing workforce development strategy to include job quality is just so key. And so really, really appreciate that effort and that focus. I also think the idea of being able to find, as of now, workarounds, but hopefully policy change to include currently excluded workers is also just so key, and really appreciate that. And now that Aki is back, I would love to ask a specific question around what has been your experience, and let me try to come off camera too. What has been your experience in terms of trying to access federal workforce dollars for some of the innovations that you're doing? Like, has that been, because I know there's a lot of innovation happening in the workforce space, but so many different organizations are really struggling to get money for it. And so just wondering, can you share what your experience has been, and if there's any insights or lessons you have in accessing that funding, I would love to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for a long time, we haven't been actually accessing workforce dollars because of the exclusions, and so many of our workers are undocumented that it just didn't make sense. So now what's changing is that we're doing more of co-enforcement models, and we've had key champions within like the state labor department, where we're able to sit down together with the workforce development people to be able to figure out how do we create accessibility, and really advocating for streamlining the way that they do funding as well. It's still kind of a works in progress, and we're just going to be trying to do some new pilots. And now that we also have Julie Sue at the US Department of Labor, we're also going to be trying to do some experimentation there. One thing that's been really helpful is actually leveraging philanthropic money to help move innovation. The government really likes working together with philanthropy, and it gets them to the table. And the philanthropic money gives us much more flexibility to actually work, because it's both the work of doing these projects and innovating, but there's also work just working with the agencies themselves. So so that philanthropic money can help us to do both of those pieces. But in California, there's a lot of barriers at the county level where most of the workforce money is given out. And something that they've done in California is create these other funding areas that are not controlled by the counties, so that there can be room for innovation also. So there's a High Road HRTP program, that is really a space that's meant for innovations. So there's these few different pots of money that are really geared towards innovation, that has different kind of measurable outcomes, that you're not so tied to certain things that would not allow you to really experiment and innovate in this way. And it just really helps to actually work with getting champions inside. That is really huge for being able to work together, because we want to propose programs like training programs and workforce development for organizers, right? To be able to, so when we have that kind of inside outside strategies, that's how we're starting to work. And then you need people to volunteer to try things out and help blaze the path of, which is sometimes really tiring, but is really important if we're going to get these like millions and millions of dollars to actually do something to build worker power.
Great. Thank you for that question. Aki, we moved into the discussion, but I don't know if you had any thoughts that you wanted to wrap up. We lost you when you're talking about the Worker Equity Initiative.
Yes, I'm so sorry. It just froze on me and took a while to come back. But let's see. I think I think I just talked about some of the stuff already that I was going to say in terms of how thinking about co-governance models, and the Workforce Initiative really helped us to have this space to bring in folks like myself who were not super knowledgeable about the complexities of the workforce development system, and help to actually create more equitable knowledge and understanding of the whole system. That's just one huge barrier. And to be in this collaborative that was facilitated to do that. And then with that knowledge, be able to, and the initiative is both like worker centers who are organizing, plus labor, as well as traditional but progressive, workforce development providers. And it's actually that bringing those folks together was really critical for coming up with new ideas and perspectives of what's actually possible, and what are like strategic ways to then move to create change. And that, and so some of these providers know how to scale up and how to deal with the data requirements and infrastructure requirements necessary for some of these projects. But then together we can think innovatively about what needs to shift there, so that we're getting to outcomes instead of just the number of jobs. Are we actually serving some of the most marginal that are being left out of the system, that really incentivizes working with the easiest folks to get into jobs, right? So, and incentivizing being able to have those wraparound supports that really get folks to, we call it Equity Island, kind of the map of the challenges that they have to navigate in the workforce development system. And so, and thinking about outcomes of like, how are you actually building worker power? So how are workers may be educated about their rights going into a job? How do they understand unions and how unions actually lift the standard of job quality? How could maybe worker centers provide these trainings so it also is not just about getting people into jobs, but helping them to organize to make sure they're good jobs and to improve the jobs also.
Thanks, Aki. I'm going to drop a link to the Worker Equity Initiative. I think Aki has been referring to a lot of the work that happened there, so that if folks want to learn more about what we did there as a steering committee. But a question came up too. I mean, we've been focusing a lot on just California. And so just wondering with other folks in the room, are there other models that other states have, or just models in other states that have helped folks leverage workforce dollars for, the low wage workers and, our areas of interest? Are we all from California? That might be.
Or we don't know of the other. Well, I mean, so the U.S. Department of Labor is like testing some pilots also in different parts of the country. They might be around strategic enforcement, but some of them I think are also going to be around workforce development. So right now, I think it's kind of like an invitation only kind of thing, but that the idea is that they start working on the ground with some pilot projects, that relationship and different understanding would be built to then be able to build out and kind of transform how the workforce development and enforcement is being done on the ground. But it takes a while for that to happen, but it's already beginning. And maybe just another thing just to say is that, we've really been advocating for philanthropy to play the role of helping organizations to become ready to build internal capacity to be able to access workforce development funds, to be able to meet the level of financial infrastructure requirements that you need, and oversight and compliance, all of that. And many of the worker centers are actually poised really well to be able to access a lot of these funds, but the infrastructure piece is still a big barrier. So that's something that we've been advocating for, so that we can actually take advantage of it and run these projects to try and do something different.
Thanks, Saki, and thanks for folks also contributing in the chat. We have about a minute left, so any last questions or comments from anyone? All right, we didn't get through to all of our questions, but we hope this is just enough a taste of what we're doing and the just the idea behind the approach of worker centers to workforce development. We know there is, we are all thinking about how the workforce system needs to change to address some of the issues that came out of the pandemic. And so our goal here is to make sure that we have a conversation about how we are more proactive and we don't continue to leave out low-wage workers as we think about, workforce development and what we need to prioritize in reshaping this economy. So any last comments, Ana Luz, anyone else?
I would just say our solutions need to be both long-term and short-term, right? We need things that we can have proof of concept and things that we can dig into right away, but we can never lose that longer-term goals, because getting to equity in our system is gonna take a much longer process. Sorry, Ana Luz, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to thank everyone for being with us today, and for LRAN for supporting our work, and for the wonderful panelists for sharing their amazing work. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you, and thank you for your partnership.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.